Flood in the Highlands by Sir Edwin Landseer, visually described by Kathleen Cowie. Flood in the Highlands by Sir Edwin Landseer is situated in Gallery 9. This gallery on the first floor of Aberdeen Art Gallery shows a collection of works which explore the theme of the royal connection and fascination with Balmoral and the Scottish Highlands, which has become known as the Balmoral phenomenon. The painting Flood in the Highlands is large. It is a landscape format, being wider than it is high. It is 10 feet wide by almost 6 foot in height and has a 27 centimetre deep gilt frame. It was painted in 1860 and the medium is oil on canvas. There's a lot happening within Flood in the Highlands, with many animals and people populating the scene. It is a narrative painting which tells the story of an event in history. This was a catastrophic flash flood which happened in the Dee Valley at the foot of the Cairngorm Mountains on the 3rd and 4th of August, 1829. The village folk escaped the rising torrential waters of the River Dee by grabbing just a few belongings and taking precarious shelter on the roofs of their simple stone and thatch dwellings. Flood in the Highlands captures this dramatic event through Landseer's eyes. I will now talk about the composition and colour of Flood in the Highlands. The villagers are clustered together with some of their animals on the thatched roofs of their homes, only slightly above the flooded banks of the River Dee below. In the foreground, to your far right and half out of the picture frame, there is a sturdy stepladder, which starts at the bottom right corner and, leaning to your right, reaches up to about half of the painting's height, but less than a quarter of the way along the horizontal length of the painting. This ladder has given our survivors access to the thatched roof. On each step there now rests a tabby cat, then, on the step above, 2 hens. One of the hens leans down as though to peck the cat. We then find ourselves on the shabby thatched roof of the first of 2 low cottage dwellings, or bothies as they are known in Scotland. These primitive but sturdy bothies would accommodate their human inhabitants in one room and livestock in the other. The angle of these 2 bothies is set diagonally, receding into the distance, the roof filling the right side of the scene to about 3/4 of the height of the painting. The roof of the bothy closest to us on the right ends when we reach its chimney stack. There is a small gap, then the gable end of the second bothy appears, and it continues to recede into the landscape. So we feel quite close to the first rooftop and the figures on it, which are large, almost life-size. As our eye is taken into the landscape, the handling of the paint is less distinct, and the second cottage recedes into a hazy, thunderous gloom with huge fallen trees brought down by the surging waters of the River Dee. The left side of the scene, around a quarter of the way along from your front left, describes the turbulent river from which a large horned bull and a ram desperately struggle to escape. We can see their bared teeth and the whites of their eyes. Their hooved front legs grasp the meagre river bank, and if we could hear them, they would be roaring and braying in panic. Below and behind them, on the lower left corner of the scene, at a slightly lower level and into the distance, we can make out the head and shoulders of a large white horse, and the remains of a red cart being sucked into the foaming waters of the Dee as they are swept downstream. The survivors on the roof are a small encampment of folk, a family group consisting of a young woman who cradles a toddler to her chest. In front of her is the toddler's empty wooden rocking cot, with the blanket cast aside as the young woman has lifted the small child out to comfort it. The young woman's eyes are wide with horror as she surveys the encroaching waters below. She is seated and her body is bowed over the child, Her knees are covered with a rough, light-coloured blanket, and she wears a white bonnet. Immediately behind the woman, to your right and slightly higher up on the roof, there is an elderly man with a long grey beard. He seems frail and exhausted. His eyes are closed, and he sits stiffly with his bony hands clasped on his lap. He wears a dark jacket and hat, contrasting starkly with the light garb of the young woman in front and to the left of him. He wears a tartan kilt in shades of grey and blue. Huddled closely up against him, leaning against his left shoulder, is a young red-haired girl who might be his granddaughter. Her mouth is agape in her pale-skinned, weary face as she surveys the swell below. In front of the old man, and just behind the step-ladder on the roof, there is a young red-haired boy wearing a checked plaid blanket in shades of blue huddled over his shoulders. His feet poke out from underneath, and they are bare, red and raw. He stares across the rooftop to the horse and cart in the river beyond. His tawny-coloured sheepdog sits close by on his left and stares faithfully and expectantly at the boy's face. On the edge of the rooftop, another black and white collie stands alert, guarding the family and his remaining flock of around a dozen sheep and goats that are also perched on the roof, towards the very top close to the ridge of the roof. Scattered about on the rooftop underneath the family are fragments of tartan blankets and family heirlooms, such as a clan shield. In the centre of the scene, and in the foreground at the roof edge, there lies a small kid goat with its mouth open, crying, and next to it lies a billy goat with large curved horns, but with its eyes closed and its neck twisted back over onto its body. One suspects that the goat might be dead. The colours throughout Flood in the Highlands are cold, with many subtle shades of grey, umber brown and blue. Occasional brighter colours and areas of pattern and tartan are generally to the front and draw us in and around the scene. The focal point of the painting is the family, particularly the young woman clutching her child. She is central within the composition and narrative and wears the lightest clothing and has the palest of skin. The dark red blanket draped over the left side of the child's cot is mirrored by a red blanket that has been bound to a branch and stuck down the bothy's chimney to signal for help. It is blown at right angles to the roof in ferocious wind towards your left side of the painting, as are all the remaining standing trees bowed over to the left in the distance. On the roof of the second cottage we see a small male figure waving and gesturing frantically for help. We could assume he is the family's father. We can almost hear the shrieks, braying and baaing of the livestock, the barking of the dogs, the wind tearing through the trees and the crashing waters of the river below. Only the humans sit in grim silence. I'll now talk about the style and technique. The painting of Flood in the Highlands is masterly. It is a realistic depiction, with clear facial features and body postures in both humans and animals, to convey true emotion, fright, exhaustion, weariness and terror. Landseer was a prolific artist. He sketched constantly and is known to have produced many witty sketches for the amusement of his aristocratic friends. He also produced many directly observed sketches of, for example, dogs, deer, birds, local people and landscape, which he then used in his studio as reference for paintings and large-scale compositions such as Flood in the Highlands. This combination of accurate studies and imaginative compositions in order to realise dramatic events in history was one of Landseer's strengths as an artist. The style in which Flood in the Highlands is painted is distinctly romantic. This means that the colours are muted and realistic. They are blended on the palette to create subtle, smooth tints and tones and applied in thin layers. Some areas may seem hazy and blurred, particularly in the distant landscape of the background, but the paint is so skillfully applied that the dark colours glow from within to create the sensation of rolling thundery clouds, of cold chill and stormy skies. Some areas in the foreground are handled with bolder brushstrokes and thicker paint, but the strokes are never apparent in themselves. If you touched the surface, you would not feel them. There is a threatening dark atmosphere within the work, where nature and climate clearly have the upper hand. I would now like to give you some background information to Flood in the Highlands. Art movements are often in opposition to what immediately went before. This is true of Romanticism, which is the genre of painting that Flood in the Highlands belongs to. Classicism, which preceded Romanticism, was the movement of logic and learning based on new discoveries in maths, science and astronomy. But Classicism was cast in doubt when a catastrophic natural disaster, the Lisbon earthquake of 1755, destroyed the densely populated city of Lisbon. Combined with the tsunami that followed, surrounding areas of Lisbon and coastal settlements throughout the Atlantic were devastated. The French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau said that the city of Lisbon was too urban and overcrowded, and advocated that a return to nature and a natural way of life was for the betterment of society. This is when the grain of Romantic philosophy took hold, and many artists, writers and thinkers of the time believed that being in tune with nature was what would save humanity and that their own work should reflect that. Romanticism grew in strength to be the foremost style in the arts of the late Georgian and Victorian era in Britain and across northern Europe. Landseer's work was the epitome of Romanticism. It had all the characteristics of a true romantic melodrama. The momentous power of nature, the chaos it might cause through catastrophe and natural disaster, the insignificance of human logic and endeavour when faced with such elemental power. In Landseer's work, animals play a major role, often cast as saviours or working on their own instincts with no apparent human guidance. His narrative works are usually peopled by indigenous local folk. This is true of Flood in the Highlands. It captures a moment fraught with fear, danger and the power of nature. I would like to tell you a bit more about the artist, Sir Edwin Landseer, R.A. Sir Edwin Landseer, R.A. was born in London in 1802. He was the son of engraver John Landseer, A.R.A. It is interesting that his father, John Landseer, who was an accomplished landscape engraver, has the letters A.R.A. after his name, meaning that he was an associate member of the Royal Academy in London, which was the leading art establishment in Britain. This was a position John Landseer vigorously challenged and spoke publicly about, as he felt that engravers should be able to become full RA members rather than mere associates. In those days, engraving was used mainly as plates for book illustrations rather than as an art form. The acceptance of engraving as an independent art form did not happen until after John Landseer's death. The young Edwin and his siblings' artistic talents were encouraged by their father. John introduced his son Edwin to the Royal Academy, and the prodigious Edwin exhibited there at the age of 13 and became a member at the age of 24, and from then on had a lifelong association with the Royal Academy. His knowledge of engraving proved useful to Edwin Landseer later in life when he, helped by his brother Thomas, produced engraved versions of his drawings and paintings, which exposed him to the general public in Victorian Britain. He was also commissioned to produce illustrations for the Waverley editions of Sir Walter Scott's novels. Sir Walter Scott was one of the most popular authors of the time. Landseer's talents were quickly recognised, and he was frequently commissioned to paint portraits of the English aristocracy or of their dogs, horses and livestock. He had become a popular and celebrated artist across class and culture. Landseer was known as a fine animal painter. His ability to capture animal expression and movement was unsurpassed. Growing up in London, he took every opportunity to draw animals. The Victorian explorers had discovered exotic animals during their forays overseas and imported lions, tigers, hippopotamus and more, bringing them back via London docks to be sold in menageries in central London, as though they were household pets. Landseer visited these places as a boy and drew these animals. He frequented London Zoo and the London parks to draw animals directly from life. Later, his tutor at the Royal Academy, Benjamin Robert Haydon, encouraged Edwin to draw from life, including during the dissections of animals. One of Landseer's most important commissions by Queen Victoria was to create a sculpture for Nelson's Column in Trafalgar Square in London. Landseer chose to represent in bronze 4 lions to guard the column. He visited London Zoo and drew a noble old lion there, which was close to the end of its life. When the animal died, Landseer dissected it to study and sketch its anatomy for his bronzes. Landseer was not trained as a sculptor, but he worked with the sculptor Baron Carlo Marochetti in a sometimes difficult collaboration to draw and model the Trafalgar lions, which Baron Marochetti then cast in bronze. Trafalgar Square, with its central Nelson's Column and 4 large lions surrounding it at each corner, lying down but alert with heads raised, sphinx-like, has become one of the most recognised and well-loved public squares in the world. And now to the royal connection, the Balmoral phenomenon. Landseer was a favourite of Queen Victoria and was invited to Balmoral to teach Queen Victoria and Prince Albert to draw, paint in watercolours and to etch. Victoria considered him to be handsome and witty, and he was included at many a gathering at Balmoral, but given distinctly humble lodgings above the stables in which to draw and paint. It was during one of these visits that the 18-year-old Landseer met the Duchess of Bedford, who was the second wife of the Duke of Bedford, and around 40 when Landseer was commissioned to paint her portrait by her husband. Georgina, the Duchess of Bedford, became the love of Landseer's life in an affair that lasted for over 30 years. In an attempt to avoid scandal, the Duchess had some simple bothies built at Glenfeshie, about 3 miles from Balmoral, where they could live together in a romantic tryst, living off the land and the game and deer that they caught. Once described as an Indian encampment, it allowed Landseer to study and sketch the wildlife of the Highlands and deer stalking at close hand, and to be with his beloved Duchess of Bedford. Monarch of the Glen, painted in 1851, depicts a single magnificent stag on the summit of a mountain range in the Scottish Highlands. It is an iconic Landseer image associated with Balmoral and is currently held in the National Galleries of Scotland's collection in Edinburgh. Monarch of the Glen has become a familiar image, particularly since the painting was bought by Dewar's Whisky in 1919. It has since been used as their brand motif on labels for whisky bottles, and providing the name for an aged blend of whisky called the Monarch, which is exported around the world. Some consider Monarch of the Glen to represent bravery and freedom, and others consider it to be cliched and part of a kitsch, subjugated portrayal of Scotland. No matter what way you perceive it, it is a memorable image. The stag is somehow both powerful yet vulnerable and completely alone in its wilderness. It may be of significance that it was painted shortly after the Duchess of Bedford turned down Landseer's proposal of marriage following her husband's death. This refusal was one of the factors that sent him on a depressive downturn from which he never fully recovered. Another factor was that his tutor of old, Benjamin Robert Haydon, was frequently in debt and had asked Landseer for money. Landseer had refused, and when Haydon committed suicide in 1846, Haydon left in his writings that his downfall was entirely due to lack of financial support from his famous former pupil. This troubled Landseer and added to his depression of later years, which was intensified with excessive drinking. What is so special about Flood in the Highlands? It is the poignant way in which Landseer captures a real moment in history, revealing the fear and chaos caused by a single terrifying event. We experience the helplessness of the animals and folk. Even the strong bull, horse and sturdy ram are struggling to survive in this traumatic event, which has been visually narrated with power and passion. We feel present in those terrifying hours. The sheer skill of Landseer's paint handling and the way in which he depicts animal and human feeling through their facial expression and bodily gesture and posture. Landseer's personal fondness and connection with Balmoral and the Scottish Highlands, and with the royal family and aristocracy. His connection with the Romantic movement through his work and his way of life. How Flood in the Highlands characterises Romanticism's high drama and the power of nature. Landseer was a celebrity. He was the most famous artist of the Victorian era, and thousands of ordinary people turned up for his funeral in London, where he was buried at St Paul's Cathedral. He died in 1873, aged 71. Flood in the Highlands rightfully has a special place here in Aberdeen Art Gallery's permanent collection. Important parts of Landseer's own story were set nearby, and the events that inspire Flood in the Highlands happened not far away on the same River Dee that flows east to meet the sea in Aberdeen. This brings me to the end of the visual description of Flood in the Highlands by Sir Edwin Landseer.